I had a middle school teacher called Dr. Avellaneda. He was my middle school Spanish teacher, and besides teaching Spanish, he also had a couple of other interesting traits that made him memorable. Because if he was just a Spanish teacher, I wouldn't be talking about it. So, what made Dr. Avellaneda such a mainstay inside my head, where I'd sometimes still think of him as someone unique in my past compared to other teachers that I've had throughout my schooling years in middle school, high school, and college? Well, one thing that made him unique was, first of all, the setting. We're in middle school. But Dr. Avellaneda used to be a college professor. It was kind of funny because us in middle school, me and my friends would sometimes think or joke about, wow, what a glow down. This guy used to be a college professor and he decided to come all the way down here to the level of middle school teaching. Granted, we were in like a special middle school program thing where it was more for, I guess you could say, gifted children. So it was accelerated, the curriculum was more intense than perhaps typical middle school level. And all the students, could say, were probably on a higher academic field than the average middle school curriculum that you would expect. Which means, in that sense, it's not really that much of a glow down. I mean, it still is a glow down compared to like college teaching, but you could reframe it and easily think of it as a new challenge because, it's a different set of skills, each to a different demographic of people. While the content you may be teaching will be harder, and not necessarily even harder sometimes in college. Because if you're teaching, I think he was teaching Spanish literature in college, so not even Spanish language. So perhaps actually it was more difficult. But if you were teaching something like Spanish language, which was what he did in for us in middle school, well, technically a lot of college classes you still have to start with the basics, Spanish 1. And while it may be more difficult than just like Spanish 1 in middle school because, well, they're college students, so they should be expected to be able to do more than simple middle schoolers. The content will still mostly be the same, right? So it's more of the style of teaching that's going to be different. You're going to be in college, have a level of student who's already an adult, usually at least 18, and they'll have developed at least 12 years of schooling, gone through elementary school, middle school, high school, so they'll have more experience in knowing how to effectively study, how to effectively prepare themselves, how to effectively learn. While if you're teaching middle schoolers, it's going to be different because that amount of experience is going to be cut in half. It's only going to be like 6 or at the max 8 for 8th graders, which is why, while it may be easier in that sense, the content you might be teaching might be slightly easier in middle school. You're now teaching to a different audience, and with that comes new skills, being able to communicate with people that are younger and still convey your points. So, in that sense, it's just a different kind of job, not necessarily a glow down. Though the pay definitely does probably reflect that it was a glow down in that regard. However, that's not the point. Point is, this guy had experience teaching to college students at a university. Now he's teaching to us middle schoolers. Middle schoolers who are, at this point, basically 12 to 14-year-olds, right? So these people are not developed people. We are not developed people. And we probably haven't even hit puberty yet, a large majority of us, as puberty is around like 15, 14. So the majority of students definitely haven't gotten there yet, and it's a different level of student involved here. And it's just gonna be difficult and different. The one thing that he tried to bring is this new style of teaching that us middle schoolers were not accustomed to, because all the other teachers we've had, they probably specialized or have only had experience with teaching middle schoolers. So their style of teaching is very familiar between teacher to teacher. We know kind of what to expect. And there aren't a bunch of curveball throws where this guy, he just has a completely different style of teaching. So what was this difference in teaching style that was so unique and influential and impressionable upon me? Well, one of the things was I remember the first class that we had with him. Basically, the first two classes, he didn't even talk about Spanish. He was just talking to us about how to learn and how to learn new information. And I remember all of us were like, what the hell is going on? Except in middle schooler terms. And we were like, this is not Spanish class. We don't even know what it is. We didn't have a concept of what kind of class this was. He was just like trying to teach us how to learn. And there were a few key words that he often said. One of them was synthesize and organize. That was one of the catchphrases that he liked to say. And this was in reference to how to learn information. And one of the more effective ways to learn and remember information, he thought, was to synthesize the information you learn and then organize it so that it is easy to remember. Synthesis being taking all the content that you learn, perhaps like this is in a textbook, maybe like 10 pages worth of textbook information, and synthesizing it into maybe one neat page of notes or some other form of remembrance. And then using those notes to organize the information and allow it to be easier, in an easier manner, stored and kept in your own brain, which is how you actually learn. And I realized I just messed up because the whole point of this video, if you clicked on it, you know what the title of this video was. No ums. And I already just said my first just like a few seconds ago. So continuing on, I'll just keep a counter of how many times I say it. Hopefully this will be the only one. Another interesting thing that this teacher brought. So already from the get-go, these first two lessons, he's talking about how to learn, how to be more effective students, stuff like that. And he wasn't talking at all about actually teaching us Spanish. It was only later on. So that already made an impression to all of us. Yeah, I just said a second time. So, what was another thing that was very interesting and unique about him? Well, he was also one of the first teachers, really one of the only teachers I've had. Not even teachers, just people in general that I've heard who really stressed on the importance of clearly saying what you want to say. And part of that involves eliminating those filler words and sounds that we are all so accustomed to. So I don't know if you've been paying attention to this particular recording that I've been doing. Been very conscious and try to not say any uhs or ums or buts. I've already failed twice, I know, but it's been 9 minutes 30. I think I've done a pretty good job only having two of them. Things like reducing those filler sounds when we're trying to think of things to say, but we don't quite have it yet. He thought that it was important to try and eliminate those sounds as much as possible and to just directly speak what was on our mind and what we were thinking. He also waged a war against filler words. So besides filler sounds like ums and uhs and is and whatever other kind of sound that you would make when you're trying to think of things, is when you're also talking in speech, oftentimes you'll use words like, as I just did there. And he really did not like it when we used those words. And it's not when we use the word like in the actual sense of the word like, where we're saying something and then we're trying to compare it to something else. So I'm like, this is a phone, it's like a this. Or some other kind of basically using the word like as a metaphor style, kind of like as a verbal metaphor where I'm trying to compare two different things. He didn't like it when we used the word like when we're just trying to fill in sound, basically. It was like a replacement for or So an example is I'm struggling to think of something. I'm struggling to explain a concept, so I'll say like, like that. I'm not gonna count that as part of the mess up counter because using it as an example. But you can see that what I just said there, I was saying like as basically it's serving the same function as any or where I'm just using it as filler, a filler word to basically have some sound and not have awkward silence while I'm still thinking about how to best describe and explain what I want to say. So, how did he wage a war to say against these kinds of phrasings? In this class, we often had a lot of presentations that we had to do. This meant like going up, and I just said light there, and that is an example of the light that he wanted to eliminate. Examples would be going up to the front of the class and giving presentations about different kinds of topics that we learned in the class, such as subjunctive or learning about different aspects of Spanish, like things that we learned. So one of the things was the subjunctive, which was more difficult, one of the more difficult units that we learned. Another one was por versus para, which was also a difficult topic. Remembering, said it right there. Remembering the different uses between the two words and when to use what versus another. And when we'd give presentations or when he'd call on us in class, so these came in two ways. We'd give presentations at the front of the class where we'd have to talk about certain things and recite things. And also, he would sometimes, during the class, he'd just be like up there at his desk and then he'd call on one of us to answer like a question that he had. He'd ask perhaps something about the subjunctive and we'd have to give an answer, right? Either in Spanish or if it was more of a general info, we could probably respond in English. And what he was looking for is during these presentations and in our question responses, when we are answering him and talking, we should not be using filler words. And he made a big point of whenever we did it, perhaps whenever is a little much. It wasn't every single time, but it was a large amount of times where I can definitely remember it, where he'd be like, please say it again, don't use the word like, stuff like that. And that would be what he'd look for. He'd be looking for when we were talking and giving presentations or responding to his questions that we wouldn't have these words. And as you can see, with me talking in this episode and me very purposely trying not to do this, not use like, and especially not use ums or uhs in my speech, it can be quite difficult to do if you aren't being very aware of it and purposeful in trying to stop it. And even when you are doing that, it still inevitably sometimes slips through because it's just such a common part of our speech. And back then, as an impressionable middle schooler, I didn't really have strong opinions about things like this. I had stronger opinions about things I was interested in, but I wasn't really interested in it. So I didn't really ever think, why is this such a big deal? Why is he making such a big deal about this? Why is this so important to eliminate us and like stuff like that? And he did explain himself when he was first introducing his explanation and thing for why he's going to be doing this whenever we like talked. He said, it's important to directly speak, say what you're trying to think. And trying to eliminate likes and uhs will make you a more confident speaker. It will allow you to convey your point more directly, and it'll, in a sense, give you a better impression when other people are hearing you speak because you don't use filler words. It makes you sound like a more confident person, someone who's more sure of their words, and someone who's more sure of themselves as well in their own ideas. And if you think about that, I would say that's true. And when I first heard it, I was like, that makes sense. Oftentimes, when I hear excessive likes, it gives me the sense that this person isn't either well prepared, or they're nervous, or they just don't know with high confidence what they're really saying. And I'm sure you can relate as the audience member. If you listen to someone ever talk about whether it just be in casual conversation or in a more formal setting where or giving presentations and explanations, they use a lot of uhs, likes. You're going to think that they're not as confident as a speaker. And this is especially more in a formal setting. In a casual conversation, everyone uses these, but if they use it to an excessive degree where you actually start noticing it, you're like, wow, this person says like a lot. This person says all the time. Does he actually know what he's talking about? You might get that sense. So that part of what Dr. Avellaneda was saying was particularly true. That was true and a correct observation that he probably made throughout his years teaching at university and now coming back down to the high school or middle school level. However, I would say this is not just the only perspective that you can have about thinking of this. It's true that having uhs and likes is excessive amounts of uhs and likes is jarring and gives you those impressions of different people that they're unconfident. But I would say that going the exact opposite, which was in a sense what he was trying to get us to do, also gives a robotic and non-natural view of somebody else. So if you're an audience member and you're listening to this right now, where I have very purposely tried to not use a single or and tried to really cut down the amount of times I'm using like as a filler word as well, I want you to leave a comment and tell me, how do you feel my conversation or how I was talking? How did it feel? Did it feel natural? Did it feel jarring? And did it feel like something that was a little bit alien? Because this kind of advice that he's told me before, it's not the first time that I've like put it into play. A lot of times when I'm meeting somebody new for the first time, or especially when I'm in a formal setting and I'm giving presentations, when I'm going through and talking, I try very hard be conscious of not using those words and instead flipping it around and maybe sometimes using different filler words that are probably less common. Or this is one strategy that he wanted us to do was be comfortable with the silence, the awkward pauses. So I'm sure you listening to this have noticed. Perhaps you've gotten annoyed at my cadence as well. Oftentimes, when I'm still thinking about what to say, it's not like I'm just saying stuff directly and very fluidly. I'm just giving out all the words in one go. I'm saying stuff and then I'm having these pauses between phrases and words and parts of my sentence where I'm still thinking about what I'm going to say next. And instead of filling it with the uhs and ums and the likes, I'm just not saying anything. And this is something that I've done more and more. And after a while, it's not as difficult to do. But one thing is, it's very hard for me to know what is the effect that this has. How do other people view this, right? Because I haven't really been asking other people. Have you noticed that I try and not to say or like a bunch, and instead I just use awkward pauses? What do you think about that? This isn't a question that I've really gone around and asked people about, right? So I don't really have evidence on whether or not it's an effective trait in practice when I'm trying to talk to other people. Do they actually like it, or do they think that it's unnatural? And the reason I have started to consider that is I think from my own perspective, I meet somebody and they're doing this. This is what I was saying about the other end of the spectrum. You have one end where there's excessive ums, uhs, like, and then you have the other end where there's none at all. And I'm thinking from my own perspective that I meet someone and I'm talking to them and they never say that word. I would say, from my perspective, I'd be like, huh, just notice that you're never saying that, right? Must mean you're doing either you're like me, where you're being very conscious on not to say it, or it just sounds alien. And perhaps the two are actually tied together as a cause and effect, where it's more like the reason I even notice this is because the speech sounds a little alien. It sounds a little jarring. And I think the jarring part comes from the silences. And I think human beings in this society that we've grown up to, we're very familiar with casual conversation and just any kind of conversation from a person, and very accustomed to there always being sound. So when there's just these long pauses where the other person is just trying to think of things to say, it will stick out to us because it's something that is not the norm and it's something that is uncommon. And the more I think about it, I think that is the case, which is why I'd love to get some information, some feedback from the audience, and perhaps I'll ask some close friends of mine too what they think about that. Whether they really notice when I'm being very explicit and meticulous about not using ums, uhs, and likes. Whether they think any of the pauses that I do are noticeable, and in fact, not just noticeable, but things that stick out to them. And that's the thing. I think, as all things in life, is always a nuanced thing, where it's not just black and white, excessive uhs and likes and ums, all of those things are bad, which means you should just cut them entirely from your speech. No, because I think the whole point of reducing your uhs, ums, and likes is to make you sound like a more confident speaker. And sometimes this can go too much. If you completely cut it from your speech, I think it depends on what kind of goal, what kind of effect you're trying to have. If you're trying to go for a complete confident speaker, in a formal setting, perhaps this would be the way to go, where you completely cut these filler words and sounds from your vocabulary and your speech. Because I guess if I do hear someone who can, first of all, speak very clearly, articulate everything that they have to say, and not have a bunch of these awkward pauses, and still at the same time just continue and not even use any of the filler words or sounds, then I for sure will have a more positive impression upon them, on their confidence level, on their aptitude, on their ability. It just gives me a positive impression. But I think it's all very dependent on your situation, right? That's good for like a formal setting. But for like an informal setting, I think the importance is not as much in establishing an air of confidence and loftiness, which often comes with this kind of speech pattern, I would say. And I think the importance is more in establishing not charisma. Charisma is not the right word. Rapport. Rapport. I think that's the word. And comfortableness. Because when you're in casual conversation with someone, it's not like you're trying to have one person be more lofty. You're not trying to establish yourself as some person that is above the other person in terms of speech and being like, oh, I'm better than you because I don't use these kinds of words. What you're trying to do is establish rapport. You're trying to build a relationship. Uh, oh, I just said it. I think I went really long without saying it, but that must be like the third or fourth time. Okay. It's not just you're trying to build rapport with the other person. You're trying to establish a verbal relationship where the two of you are comfortable in talking about all manners of things. And part of that is going down to a more comfortable and more familiar level. Because if you adopt this really formal lingo, like imagine you're talking to someone and they talk like they're coming straight from the 1500s, talking in old English. Well, that's not going to be something that would make you very comfortable, right? It's not going to give you, I guess, the most positive impression because it makes you feel like they're doing a bit. It makes you feel like they're not actually being themselves. They're not being authentic. They're trying to be a particular person. And that's what happens when you try and cut all of these filler words and sounds from your language. Because I think it's inevitable. When you're talking fast and you're trying to actually explain your thoughts, when you're really passionate about something, what you're focused on is going to be about the passion that you're describing. And it's not going to be about, oh, when I'm describing this passion, I should not be saying or like. So when you're describing a passion in casual conversation, you're just talking about things that you enjoy doing, things that are fun to talk about in casual conversation. If you start noticing that this person is not saying any of these filler words, it gives you the impression that they're more focused on correcting their own speech instead of actually explaining their own supposed authentic passions and likes. And it just gives a non genuine feeling to what they're saying. So, because of that, I think it's important that whenever it's dependent on the environment, on the situation, as everything is always nuanced. There's no black and white. In certain situations, it's better to completely eliminate the uhs and and like. And in other situations, it's better to reduce, but it's also good to have some because it gives way to more of a genuine and more familiar feeling to other people when you're talking with them. And that is the whole point of having casual conversations is to build these stronger verbal relationships that you can then carry on and develop later on with more shared experiences. So, Dr. Avellaneda, this very unique figure, he had a lot of good ideas. And he was the first person to give and implant this idea of reducing and being conscious of the number of filler words and sounds that you use in your normal speech. And for that, I have to thank. But I think his take was lacking a little bit of nuance. And perhaps he really thought what I was thinking as well, that it's not a black and white thing. He just didn't really communicate that with us when we were middle schoolers. And in the classroom, he was trying to go for the other more extreme approach, which, to be fair, as I've said myself, in more formal settings, perhaps that is what you want to go. And in the classroom, where we are not peers, we're not equals. He's in a position of power as a teacher, in a higher position, and we're students. This is a more formal setting, and perhaps that is what he was going for. But since he was trying to give it as advice, I think he was lacking that nuance about talking where, depending on the situation, perhaps completely eliminating your filler words, sounds is not the right way to go. And I think that was the main point that I want to say in this one. Uh, okay, I'll give myself that one. The fifth and final in this 30-minute episode. You in the comments, if you've been listening to this, please let me know if you felt that I was being just a little alien, a little foreign with how I was talking. I am very curious here. I think as a final wrap up, I'll talk about some of the strategies that I do. So I've started to be more cognizant of the ums, the filler sounds and words, right? So how do I go about and eliminate those from my speech while still trying to sound, somewhat normal? There are two main strategies. The first one is whenever you would think of using a or an or any kind of filler sound, just don't say anything. And this is something that is quite difficult because silence is unnerving. And this is a natural feeling because in normal conversation, if you just have long periods of silence, it seems like the other person, is they're just thinking for a long time and the whole conversation flow is broken. And that just leads to awkwardness, which is something that you want to avoid in conversation. Even in more formal settings, having long periods of silence, it means the other person, it gives almost the same exact effect as having filler sounds. It's just like the other person really is not very confident in what they're trying to say because they don't have the words right now and they have to spend such a long time to think about the next words that they have to say. However, if you manage to cut down the windows of silence, and most of the time you're not going to be excessively doing that, right? If you're at that stage where if you're going to excessively, for a whole 1, 2, 3 seconds, have a filler sound, even if you replace it with silence, that was already going to be an L because it meant you really didn't actually know what you were going to say, and it's not just part of normal conversation. And in that sense, it's something that is kind of unavoidable. It's just something that would have happened because in that conversation, you wouldn't have known what to say, and it wouldn't have mattered if you used filler sound or just had silence. It's in the other parts where you do know what to say, or perhaps you don't, but it's very, very fast. You think of what you have to say. Instead of using the filler sound, use the filler silence. And I think that is something that can be difficult at first, and it's just something you have to get used to doing and practice not actually saying stuff and just having silence hang. The other way to fill the silence is instead of using filler sounds, it's kind of like a cheat. It's just elongating some of the words that you have so that it gives you more time to think about what you have to say. So instead of just saying everything with its intended syllables, just saying it right away, quickly, without any pause. Instead, can just elongate and put emphasis on different words that you say. As I just did there, hopefully you understood as an example. I am emphasizing certain words, and you don't do it excessively, it will give you the amount of time that you need, those split seconds, to think of what you're trying to say next. And the key is not doing it excessively. And if you don't do it excessively, then it will seem mostly pretty natural. As a and you have achieved your goal as well of not using filler sounds, and instead you're just putting emphasis on certain words. In fact, it can maybe even boost your sense of confidence, where it seems like you are given a interesting style in the way you talk, where your cadence of saying it's not like a monotone thing. You're giving emphasis to different words, and it could be something different compared to what most other people do. So I think those are the two strategies that I mainly use when I am purposely and consciously trying to avoid having filler sounds and filler words in my speech. I will, first of all, identify where I would be using filler sounds, and I just have the silence hang. And when I want to reduce the amount of silence there is, I would just, first of all, employ this tactic of extending and putting more emphasis onto certain words. So my speech is more of like a sing song, this and that, instead of this and that and this and that and this and that. Part of it is just slowing down your speech at certain points. And this allows you the time that is needed, where instead of using the filler words, you just have these extended sounds, and it gives you the time needed to think of what next you're trying to say. So, in conclusion, hopefully this was an enlightening audio experience, and maybe you'll take that into your own conversations going forward. Be more conscious of the filler words and sounds that you use, and perhaps change a little bit of how you talk. And hopefully, it will have the results that you want, being a more confident person.